Thank you, Bill and Jennifer. We have some time for questions, but before I move on to that, noted there's one there, I must apologise again to Bill for having vilified him as going to the VILAC meeting. There's a little bit of personal history there by way of justification I should explain, which is that Bill and I have recently been co-authors of a new book which has the title Taxing Air, which when you think about it is a very good title. And it's Socratic in style. It poses 100 questions, such as a member of the public might ask. Is global warming happening? What is the climate normal? Is carbon dioxide a greenhouse gas? And so on. And then for each such question that's posed, there's a one-line answer, and then there's a 4 or 5 paragraph more detailed answer. Anyway, one of the questions posed is the antecedents to the IPCC, and the 3 paragraphs about that, which was the VILAC conference, were written by Bill in great style. And of course, I've remembered falsely, because he wrote those 3 paragraphs, he must have been at that conference. So my apologies, Bill, but thank you for the style with which you wrote that part of the book, and the other parts of the book. Now, question down here. No, microphone behind you.
So I come from Canada. We've had similar issues. So the global warming seems to be quite popular in the previous government, which is called the Liberal government, which is the more left-wing party in my country, passed the Kyoto Accord, and then our government, the present Tory government, has withdrawn from the Kyoto Agreement. Are you part of the Kyoto? Have you signed Kyoto?
We did sign it. Kevin Rudd signed it, yes. But I'll ask George to respond to that, but before I do, I must comment, I wish these governments had sought out their terminology. It is so confusing to have Liberal meaning left-wing in Canada, right-wing in Australia, and, well, communist almost in America. George.
The Liberal Party, the left-wing party, completely ignored the Kyoto targets, completely overwent. So they passed it, but they did absolutely nothing about it.
I was aware of that, but let George comment on your question.
Well, we are unfortunately a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol, and we haven't unsigned it or withdrawn from it. I mean, that protocol is becoming vastly redundant anyway, but I mean, the one thing that was done even before the Kyoto Protocol was ratified was by John Howard, who was a Conservative Prime Minister, and that was the renewable energy target. Now, just to quickly talk on that, the renewable energy target requires that 20% of all energy that's produced must come from renewable sources. So there's a scheme that's set up with certificates that power generators have to get a certain number of certificates that basically makes up 20% of the power that they're producing. The problem is that 20% was factored in by, economists and boffins. They spat out a number at the end and said, this is how many, megawatts that you're going to have to buy from renewable sources. The problem is that we've been in a period of industrial decline in Australia, most probably contributed by policies like this. What's happened is that the 20% is probably nearing 30% or more. So there's currently debate going on in Australia about what we should do about this renewable energy target, and I can tell you that by and large the majority of us want to get rid of it. It is causing industry no end of pain, and I hear that some of your states have moved here in the US to introduce these mandated targets. Can I say rail against them? They are detrimental to industry, detrimental to jobs, and they're detrimental to the household budget as well, because it pushes power prices up.
Thank you.
Can I just make
Sure, Bill.
Make a comment on the situation Australia versus Canada. In the negotiations for the Framework Convention in 1991, being a delegate there, you were mixing with all the people from around the world who were sort of representing their governments and so forth. And time again, people would come up to me and say, well, why is Australia taking a leading position in this? Look, you've got a big country with broadacre agriculture, which requires a lot of fuel for the tractors and transport and so forth. you're a mining country, you're using energy to dig up the resources and so forth. Why are you there? And it still baffles a lot of people, including myself, as why we were there, but essentially it was because of the policy at home, the domestic policy. There was this overwhelming push by certain areas that we should be doing something. And it's the same in Canada, but then Canada wisely didn't do anything.
Before I take the next question, just a comment to follow that, which is over the 6 years we've had the introduction successively of these renewable energy tariffs and the carbon dioxide tax. Australia has gone from being second or third cheapest source of energy supplies into the community on the OECD list to second to third most expensive in 6 years. Now you contemplate the flow-through effects on the economy of that, and that's what George is talking to when he says some of our problems are coming from that. Sonia. Oh, sorry, we have a gentleman behind you first, and Sonia.
Yeah, yes, I would like to hear you compare how the press in Australia has handled it versus what is happening in the United States.
Jen, perhaps you'd like to have a go at that.
The political class in Australia tends to listen to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation over the last couple of years has really placed a black ban on the interviewing of people like Bob Carter and Bill Kininmonth. If you go back 5 years, one used to hear Bob and Bill on radio, and even myself occasionally I would get on a panel on the ABC. But more recently, skeptics are considered to be a voice that should not be heard, and because we are such a small percentage, apparently, of the scientific community. Certainly, there are a lot of scientists who are sceptical, but most science in Australia is government funded, and sceptical scientists that are government funded keep their mouths shut.
Bill, or do you want to add to that?
Yes.
Just to verify the point that was made about not getting invites onto the ABC and so forth, I was actually in the when I was active in the Bureau of Meteorology, we were actually in the business of giving services to the community, and they have a program called Landline for the rural people, which I was quite regularly on the television. And so I was quite well known to the ABC people. And after I retired, they kept asking me for my views. But then when my views on climate change became known, I got less and less invites, including the fact that one evening I was asked, or about 2 days beforehand, I'd been asked to, they were doing a program, would I come on and be on air, and so go into the ABC studio, and they were going to link it up to Sydney where the program was. So I said, yeah, that's fine. It had been arranged on the telephone. I went in there this evening at some inconvenience, and got there. They said, oh, well, sorry, we don't know anything about you being on this program. And that was it. Not even the courtesy of saying, look, we're sorry with this, there's something else has come up, we're not going to invite you, or somebody else is coming on, or whatever. Just turn up and it's not on anymore. And the director of the science program in the ABC is on record as saying that he didn't want people like me on the program, on the ABC programs. Before
I ask for the next question, I'll just add one thing to that, which is my experience of that, is the phenomenon of disinvitation. All academics are used to having invitations to give talks at Rotary or at conferences or to the local school, but it's not until you get into the skeptics game that you learn this phenomenon of disinvitation, which Bill has almost touched on there, where you're invited to give a talk at some conference, you prepare for it and get ready, and then the letter or the phone call comes that says, sorry, we don't want your services after all. So bias and prejudice against independent science comment is alive and well in Australia.
I've been following the Australian debate from a distance. I noticed at the same time with all these political maneuverings that Australia ships millions of tons of coal to China. Australia may be the biggest exporter of coal in the world.
I hope we are.
I conclude, therefore, that all these schemes for carbon tax, ETS, the whole pack, in terms of the global CO2 levels, are completely futile.
Well, that's a comment rather than a question, and I could not disagree with it.
We've got policy schizophrenia almost. You're right, policy schizophrenia. We want the coal to go out to the rest of the world. We want them to buy it, but we want to stop emissions. I mean, it's crazy.
Could I make a comment from somebody who has... I actually had a research grant once to study the climate policy of Australia, and I spent several months, half a year, in Adelaide. I spent some time in Adelaide to study the climate policy, interviewed a large number of Australian scientists, and I know that Australia was very involved at the beginning. The IPCC, they were actually administratively in charge of one of the working groups. Actually, Taggart, I think was his name, like Taggart or somebody. Anyway, so I know quite a bit, and I'm very grateful to you for bringing it up to date. I'm still wondering about the Murdoch press. I can't quite see the Murdoch press taking the same position as the ABC.
No.
I'm also aware, when I was there, that the Australians were very sensitive to the charge of being one of the highest per capita emitters of carbon dioxide, which makes good sense because the distance is a climate, you know, it didn't, but it was taken a bit of as a...
Well, that can be offset against the fact, which is never put in public, but is in the book Taxing Air I've just told you about, that Australia absorbs from the atmosphere over 10 times the carbon dioxide emission it emits.
Yeah.
So it depends entirely what parameter you want to employ, and the one you've just chosen is, of course, the preferred green critical one.
Sensitive at the time.
Sure. But it's still sensitive and still used.
And I just want a report to add up to you. You mentioned Ainsley Keller. And I'm very pleased that you mentioned him because I wrote a book with him published in 2002, which was called International Environmental Policy, The Failure of the Kyoto Process. I haven't heard anybody mention this. So I think it was a very important book, which did inspire some people here, that, you know, political scientists could see what was wrong a long time ago, and 10 years have passed, and, you know, it's just a question why, you know.
Well, thank you, Sonia. I have to say that I own the book. I agree with you. It's an excellent book. If it has a problem in getting into the public debate, it is, of course, because it's an academic text. That's the difficulty. But it is an excellent book, and I recommend it to people.
Just to comment on your question about the Murdoch press, while it has been putting sometimes some alternative perspectives, just a few days before I left to come here, I did read that the ABC had been attacking the Murdoch press because of a position on something, and the editorial in the Australian was explaining that it was the position of the Australian newspaper to support an ETS. I thought it extraordinary that the Australian was actually saying that was their position, or it may have been a column by Paul Kelly on the Saturday before I left. And the Australian newspaper takes positions on all sorts of environmental issues, and as does the ABC, which I find quite extraordinary, because for democracies to be healthy, we need a fourth estate that is sceptical, and we don't have that in Australia, be it the Murdoch press or be it the ABC. Then we have a lot of television channels that have journalists who are interested in scepticism and believe that their viewers would be interested in the issue, but there are gatekeepers above them who block these programs from going forward. So it's really quite extraordinary the extent to which the Fourth Estate has become a gatekeeper for the dissemination of the information that it feels the populace should have access to. And it's very unhealthy to have that situation in a democracy.
Can I just make a point about the Murdoch press? I'm familiar with the Australian, which is the national paper that Rupert Murdoch has as his flagship. And they've consistently had the position that they give the planet the benefit of the doubt, and that they advocate an ETS scheme, and they've always done that when the rest of the world does as well. And I must say that over the years, the Australian has been fairly open when the early days in the 2005, 2008, I actually had a number of opinion pieces published in the Australian, so that the argument was they were open to the argument, and I think that the Australian, to a large extent, does give both sides of the view on a range of issues. I mentioned Graham Richardson, the then Minister for the Environment. He's now a regular columnist on the Australian. And so they give both sides of all of these.
Yes, I agree, Bill. They do. They do.
This is probably best answered by George. In the United States, a treaty is law by Constitution. What is it in Australia? Just a policy?
Could you say that again? The United States?
In the United States, a treaty is law, just as if it's passed by Congress. What is it in Australia? Is it a policy that can be discarded at will?
Look, they have to be ratified by the Parliament. Once they're ratified by the Parliament and the Executive, then they're enforced. Unless, and it depends what's in the treaty. If there's a get-out clause like what Lord Monckton was just talking about, well, perhaps, we can get out of it. But look, it's a question, I suppose, and it goes to legal sovereignty, that if you're a sovereign nation, are you beholden to any treaty that you get into? Well, I think that any nation can jettison a treaty if they really want to. It's just withstanding the international backlash from pulling out of it if the treaty doesn't let you to pull out of it. That's the ultimate answer to it, I suppose.
One last question.
Yes. In Australia, do they have legal mechanisms that would help you as a country to go through the science that underlies the regulations, such as, do you have an economic cost-benefit analysis mechanism within law that requires them to look at the the benefits and the costs? Do you have a regulatory impact assessment that agencies must perform in order to justify the regulation?
George.
And thirdly, do you have peer review mechanism requirements where the peer review underlying major agency actions have to be peer reviewed at a certain standard?
Well, I'll let the last, you want to answer the peer review one? Yeah, okay. Look, we don't have any mechanisms like what you're talking about for the first 2 points. We should have. In fact, in my first speech, my maiden speech to the Parliament, I said that we needed a Royal Commission to actually be held to determine the validity of the so-called science behind climate change before we go down the path of accepting policies that are designed to somehow combat it. And I still think that that's the case. There is an opportunity because what the last government set up was this climate change commission or something like that, which the Palmer United Party now, for some strange reason, wants to keep in place. And I would love to see, Bill Kininmonth, Jennifer Marohasy and Bob Carter appointed to the commission, and we can go through all the science and actually do that.
We're waiting for the letter, George.
But we do have a national audit
we do.
body, and for example, this government, this Labor government, is very aware of the homogenisation. I would go as far as to suggest the corruption of the official Australian temperature record, or that the official Australian temperature record is a corrupted record because it does not represent the observational data. It does not reflect the trends in temperature from the temperature record. But it is choosing not. This current government is choosing not to address that issue.
Well, we'll have to fix that. And Jennifer's right. We do have a national audit office, which job is to go through different government departments and make sure that things are being done right. You know, the stuff that Jennifer's talked here today about what the Bureau of Meteorology are doing, it should be looked at by the National Audit Office. But as for the peer review, perhaps...
Well, I'll pick up the peer review one. No, there is no formal requirement for peer review. It operates conventionally in the scientific sphere in Australia. Given the way which peer review has been corrupted, I believe almost to the point of unusability, or perhaps I should say unuseful ability, I'm not sure I'd want to recommend that particular solution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it from Lord Monckton at lunchtime, and you heard a similarly almost as impassioned plea from Jennifer Marohasy here that the Fourth Estate worldwide is not doing their job. And if there's one thing we could all take away from this conference, it is that thought, and we should do everything we can to embarrass the major media sources into lifting their game. So thank you for coming, and let's join now in applause for the three speakers we have had this afternoon.